One more day to Vital and Harmonia. This is the first session in the module 2 of the introductory course on soul therapy, inner discovery, based on the principles of Harmonia in the Tree of Life. And this module 2 is about alimentation in general. We are going to explore different types of food, spiritual, psychological, physical foods, all of which are related, and our integral health depends on the dynamics between them. And we are going to be using the Sephirotic tree as a scheme to understand the connection between different foods. Remember, the Tree of Life has 13 spheres, but usually most traditions represent 10 because they are incomplete. Remember, we have a core of being, which is an emanation of the infinite holy being, and from our true core, our unity, emanates a whole tree of reality with 12 fruits, and we have to eat from them in order to be expanding our qualities, to grow as branches in the tree of life and give fruit, become a tree in ourselves. And remember what the Master said: man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the divine verb, the Yud He Vav He. By the word of Yud He Vav He all things were made. This is said in Psalm 33:6. And obviously, this does not mean the holy being has a mouth or that the divine verb has a mouth, but rather that there is an emanation of infinite loving light, magnetic light, coming from the infinite beingness. And this emanation of light is food in itself, a spiritual food, full of harmonias, full of vitality, qualities that feed, expand our soul, our divine soul. And it's also interesting to see we have different foods, especially three. We can classify them in physical foods, then the air that we breathe, and finally the impressions, living impressions that feed our conscience, which is part of our soul. We can survive without ingesting physical food for weeks, even more than a month, by force, obviously. And we can survive a few seconds or a few minutes, maybe, without breathing, without air. But we cannot survive without living impressions. This was even proven decades ago when some people were subjected to complete isolation, sense deprivation. These people were deprived even from the sense of touch somehow. And the results were obvious. They lost certain mental faculties. They got mad somehow. Obviously, those people were forced to those conditions in inhuman circumstances. And this is a proof that we need impressions in order to survive, moment by moment. Therefore, the most important food is not physical, not even the air, but it's a food of conscience. This is the first fact that we have to keep in mind. Now, in order to see how all these foods relate, we can use the Sephirotic tree. There is actually a Hebrew wisdom which says that Keter, the crown of life, relates to breathing and therefore to the element of air, which is the second food. So let's become aware of life in us through conscious breathing. Notice how the body breathes on its own. We don't have to force anything. We don't have to apply any technique. simply become aware of how the air goes in and goes out. It's easier to pay attention breathing through the nose. And sometimes when we are anxious, nervous, our breath becomes superficial. We breathe with the upper chest. Maybe we feel some tension. This area becomes tight, and therefore we have to relax. And notice that deep breathing goes to the bottom of the lungs, and usually the belly expands a little bit. But as the breathing becomes more and more serene, then even the belly remains still. We can remain very serene with very little thread of breathing. For instance, relax consciously and pay attention to your breathing. Notice how this represents life in us and is always present. We are constantly breathing, even when we are not aware. But as we become more aware of breathing, then certain elements present in the air are absorbed, not just nitrogen, oxygen, but also particles of important elements that come from the sun, the planets, the moon, even this earth, obviously. And all these elements pass through our lungs into the blood, and they generate a magnetism that forms what is known as vital soul, which is essential to keep the organs healthy. And this vital soul can even be developed and harmonized to form a soulish body. And the more conscious we become of our breathing, the more elements are absorbed, the more can we exert a conscious influence on the magnetism of the blood, because it expands, it grows. This is why ancient cultures develop arts of breathing that somehow use the breath as a form of increasing energy. In the East, Oriental teachings speak about the chi. And this is very true, but obviously there are more types of food that we have to take into consideration. Going to the sphere of Chokmah, wisdom, we have the element of water. And water is a beautiful element, not just a food, but a teacher, because it's transparent or can be transparent, therefore it can become like pure consciousness. Wisdom is intuitive, it gives us a transparent sense of what we have to do, who we are. We also have to be like mirrors, and life is also a mirror. All that we experience is telling us something about ourselves, because our perception is connected to it. And years ago, there was here in Spain a commercial in which Bruce Lee said, "Be water, my friend." And this is an old Taoist saying, which somehow expresses how we have to be flowing through the points of lesser resistance. That's to be like water, something which is essential to absorb all we need from life, from the infinite holy being, which is constantly emanating supraconditional love and modified life, integral serene conscience. And once we become aware of these elements, we can even absorb better certain physical food, which is related to the sphere of understanding, a sphere in which we see opposites interacting. Actually, we are going to see in a while how different physical foods correlate with the right and left side of the Sephirotic tree. But before going into this, let's explore the sphere of Da'at Elyon, elevated knowing, which we can call conscience, and is between Chokmah, wisdom, and understanding, Binah. And realize conscience has nothing to do with acquiring intellectual data. Curiously, most Sephirotic trees put that knowledge between wisdom and understanding, considering a knowledge which would be a result of those two spheres. Some say that represents a surrounding consciousness, but this is not conscience, and we are not looking for intellectual knowledge. That alone is like data introduced into a computer to get an output, a response, which is mechanical, robotic, and we are not robots, even though society turns people into robots with intellectual knowledge and different patterns of behavior. But we are looking for the conscience which is in us, even though we are not aware of it. Now, as soon as we become aware of conscience in us, then we start to perceive certain qualities of life and also grow in divine soul, so to say. These qualities are known as values. They make people, experiences, relationships, or even things valuable. And values can be classified as well. There are what we could call spiritual, intellectual values, such as truth, unicity, which comes from unity. The core of our being is a unity from which an harmony of interrelations emerge, and those are in unicity. And when we perceive all these relations, we perceive the truth. So all these are values that make our being valuable. We also have ethical values such as responsibility, goodness, honesty, equanimity, dignity, generosity, different qualities that make a person someone worthy to be with. We love to be with people that are full of a certain vibration of life. And this is healing, this is a food. This is why we like to be with certain people, and we miss certain people when we are away. But realize we also have to develop these qualities in ourselves, and we can also feed ourselves connecting with the divine soul within, so that we don't have to feel lonely just because we are not with a person. We have a connection within, and that connection is conscience, which is always present. Remember this, we don't have to get conscience. It's always present, but we are not aware of it. Now, as soon as we become more and more aware of the qualities of true divine soul, then we also see aesthetic values such as beauty, elegance, proportionality, harmonia. And this is an amazing source of spiritual food because it feeds our soul. Notice, for instance, when we are having a walk in nature and we see the proportions in the trees, the flowers, the amazing colors they have. All this feeds our soul because they are living impressions. They are not just sensory data. Neuroscience is missing many important keys by just examining the human being as a brain full of electrochemical interrelations. We are more than flesh. We are a living soul that has to be expanding when we express the true humanity of light, of course. If we are just mere social, cultural individuals, this I'm saying has little sense. But I am addressing those who have a true soul within. I would say scientists and politicians are more focused on utilitarian values, even biological values, which are not necessarily in tune with true life. For instance, mm, economic values, cheap, expensive, efficient, strength is a value, resilience, capacity of recovery, even hygiene or health are values regarded as important in our society. But this can be part of a utilitarian way of understanding life. If mm, a society looks for a certain type of health by means of making mm, business with certain drugs, then we are not in tune with true life. And the same goes for the rest. Obviously, vitality is one of the most important values in life, strength, resilience. But these have to be understood in the proper context of the soul. Now, once we have in mind the importance of values, which are qualities perceived through conscience, mentally and emotionally, then we can understand much better how we relate to physical food. In conventional nutrition, we are told that we need macronutrients, carbohydrates, which are sugars, fats, and proteins. However, when we examine the physical body from a rather psychological and a spiritual point of view, what we need are micronutrients, which are obviously present in certain foods, but we'll see the paradigm of carbohydrates and fats to be burned and to get energy is a little bit obsolete because the body is not an oven, the body is an alchemical organism that transforms energy. It doesn't burn fats nor sugars. And we can classify, obviously, fats, sugars, and proteins, minerals, and vitamins within the Sephirotic tree as well. For instance, Chesed, the sphere of mercy, is related to sugars, but there are different types of sugars. And it's very obvious why sugars in general are connected to the sphere of loving kindness or mercy. The first thing we do when coming into this physical world is to breathe in. But then our mom gives us milk which contains lactose, a complex sugar comprised of glucose and galactose, which are simple sugars that are absorbed very easily by the body. And it's also true that later on in life, our mom gave us sweets, especially during birthday parties. And we also associate all those foods with a certain lovingness. And there is a complete connection between this association and certain cravings for complex sugars, not just any sugar, but complex sugars are the most addictive sugars, especially starch. You won't see anyone addicted to spoons of white sugar because normally white sugar is mixed up with starch in pastries, biscuits, cakes. All that is very addictive. Obviously, it's more addictive a piece of cake with marmalade and other sugars than without them. But what is addictive is not simple sugar because that's an essential element. And you'll notice how today there is a sort of popular myth which says, oh, sugar is very bad for you, don't eat sugar. Something which makes no sense because the main physical food is glucose. Our blood is full of glucose. When we are sick and are taken to a hospital, what we get in the serum is glucose. So, what type of sugar are we talking about? Simple sugars such as glucose, fructose even, which is present in fruits, is nutritious. Complex sugars have to be broken down into simple sugars. However, not all complex sugars can be broken, even though we have certain enzymes such as amylase in the saliva, and this breaks down part of the starch, but not all of it. And starch leaves lots of residue and forces the body to produce mucus in order to protect the inner organs. The problem is that addiction to starch generates not only residue within the digestive tract, but also an excess mucus, and this congests the organs. This is the main origin of all diseases. Anyone, infections, bacterial overgrowth, or even diabetes, because if the pancreas is congested by mucus, it cannot produce enough insulin to get the blood into the cells, so sugar remains floating in the blood, and this feeds parasites, fungi, and erodes also the internal walls of the veins. Some people are even born with a deficiency in the pancreas and they suffer from diabetes type 1. The pancreas doesn't produce insulin at all and they have to inject it. But I think these are consequences of generations and generations of incorrect food behaviors. Obviously, it comes a point in which all that somatizes as an apparently chronic disease, which I think has a solution. Now let's focus now on proteins. These belong to the sphere of Geburah force. Obviously, proteins are part of our muscles, and many say we need proteins in order to build up muscle, but this is again wrong. The body builds up its own proteins, and to understand this, think for instance in some of the strongest animals. Gorillas don't eat sticks of meat or eggs, don't eat meat. That's not part of their main diet. They eat leafy greens almost all day, that's true. And there are proteins in those vegetables, but their body is breaking down all the elements, getting amino acids, nitrogen, and other substances in order to produce its own proteins. And gorillas are incredibly strong, much stronger than any of those bodybuilders that eat whey protein and steaks and eggs. And I think the need for an excess load of protein is related to mental weakness. If a man feels the need to give the sense of being very strong physically, maybe he is weak psychologically. Actually, it comes to mind an anecdote by Viktor Frankl, a doctor who suffered in a concentration camp, and he observed how those who were apparently stronger physically died very soon, whereas some people who were weak physically managed to survive. And this was mainly because they had certain religious belief or other type of belief that made them want to live, to overcome any situation. So strength is not so much a question of ingesting too many proteins. Maybe proteins are required to a certain extent, especially certain type of vegetable protein or proteins present in fruits, but the proportion is much lower than the proportion recommended by conventional nutrition. Now, then we have fats, and these are associated with the sphere of tiferet, beauty. Obviously, fat is necessary to build up certain tissues. The brain information requires lots of fats. When we are fed by our mom, we receive lots of fats from her milk, and therefore this also gives us a sense of protection. Therefore, the need for fats is also related to the need for protection. And if a person feels rejected, victimism, self-pity, obviously is going to have a certain crave for dairy and other types of fats. But dairy is a very common element to cover up certain emotional needs. Actually, I remember that due to certain traumas, I felt lots of victimism and self-pity, and I was addicted to dairy, especially butter and cheese mixed up with starch, bread, and biscuits. That makes dairy even more addictive. And the truth is that after a certain age, we don't need milk anymore because the brain is already formed, or it has enough fat to produce its own fats. And we see this even in nature. You won't see any adult animal drink milk. Something humans do because that's part of our culture, which is a culture full of disease, full of destruction, full of violations. And right now, there are many people who are intolerant or allergic to dairy. I developed intolerance to dairy or even allergies. My body got covered with violent reactions years ago. Actually, I quit dairy completely. This does not mean that if I eat cheese one day or drink a glass of milk, I'm going to get sick. Probably not. I've done the test and I was okay, but that's not part of my diet. I don't need it anymore. I've worked emotionally. I don't feel victimism or self-pity anymore. And this helps. So if you have a food disorder or some allergy, don't think just in the physical food. Look inside, find out how you feel and why, and release all those tensions consciously. Now, then we have the sphere of netzach, victory, which is associated with vitamins and enzymes. These elements boost our organs. They contribute to harmonize our metabolism, and obviously they are connected to victory. Paradoxically, due to an excess of starch, the body produces so much mucus that vitamins and enzymes are not absorbed. And there is an even greater paradox, which is that vitamins get destroyed at 60 degrees centigrades and enzymes get destroyed at 40 degrees centigrades. So when you cook your vegetables or your meat or whatever, you get rid of vitamins and enzymes. We can get, obviously, vitamins and enzymes from certain vegetables or juices, but they have to be consumed fresh, organically, and very few products have a good quality nowadays. We'll have to see all that in later sessions because obviously we can have cook vegetables and get the source of vitamins by other means. I'm not saying consuming tablets or artificial vitamins because that is useless. The body needs to absorb organic vitamins elements that come from naturally, or rather natural elements, environments. Now we move to the sphere of order, associated to the mind, the splendor. And here we have the minerals, which are essential for the bones, the functioning of the brain. For instance, phosphorus is crucial in mental brain activities. And as you see, all this fits perfectly. And obviously, not all minerals are absorbed properly because there is too much mucus, because of the diets in which people mix everything with everything else, especially starch and protein, some of the most acidifying elements. And we are going to be seeing many reasons why all these elements we have seen need to be in proportion. Obviously, if we eat too many complex sugars, especially starch, our body is going to be congested on many levels. If we eat too many proteins, then it's going to get acid because proteins get rotten and they get fermented, mixed up with starches. If we eat too many fats, our body is going to be acid as well because fats are a source of acidification. No matter how many minerals and vitamins we can ingest, even with tablets or things like that, if we are congested, if we cannot absorb, or if organs don't work properly. So all these things have to be taken into consideration, remembering also the importance of the emotions, the mind, the anemic aspect of alimentation. And now realize how all the spheres get somehow condensed in the sphere of Yesod, the sphere of vitality, which on a physical level is a condensation of all the elements. We have organs that work with their own alchemy to produce certain hormones and proteins, fats, anything we need. Because micronutrients are used to generate macronutrients, if you wish, but that's done by the body. It doesn't come ready-made from the outside. And then from the sphere of vitality, notice how all manifests in Malkut, the so-called kingdom, which in this world is a kingdom of life and death. There is a combination, whereas in true reality there is a true manifestation of life where no death is present. But in order to understand how to get into those spheres, we have to understand how to live in this world and know how to eat rationally. So the following day I will be exploring certain radical diets that are popular nowadays and why we should move gradually into a more rational type of diet depending on our circumstances, our interests, what's our aim in life, because obviously everyone is different and not everyone can have the same type of diet because no one has the same degree of toxicity in the body, so all this changes the situation. But we can clean up many things that are harming us by understanding how all this works. But this will be for the following day. For now, thank you very much for listening with attention. If you have some questions, leave them in the box of comments. And until the next time, let's keep feeding our soul with living impressions, paying attention to how we relate to food. Let's avoid filling inner voids with physical food. Let's expand our conscience and realize that we are infinite beings full of life. Therefore, let's keep breathing consciously, opening a space for the manifestation of supraconditional love and modified life integral conscience, and deep, blissful serenity.